Before the world knew her as one of the most captivating women in Hollywood, Ava Gardner was already living a life that refused to follow rules. She wasn't manufactured by the studio system, and she never tried to be perfect. There was something raw about her, something real. And that same honesty carried into her relationships, especially the most famous one of all, her turbulent, passionate, and ultimately destructive marriage to Frank Sinatra. To the public, their love story looked like a fairy tale. Two icons, two legends, a romance filled with glamour, music, and headlines. But behind that image, there was another story, one that Ava Gardner would later reflect on with striking honesty. A story that revealed a side of Sinatra the world didn't always see. Ava Gardner never sugarcoated her past, and as she looked back on her life, she made it clear that loving Frank Sinatra came with a price. When Ava first met Sinatra, he was already one of the biggest stars in the world. But their connection wasn't built on fame. It was immediate, intense, and deeply emotional. Sinatra became obsessed with her, completely captivated. He pursued her relentlessly, and eventually, she gave in to that intensity. What followed was not a calm romance, but a storm. One of the first things Ava would later acknowledge was Sinatra's emotional volatility. He wasn't just passionate, he was unpredictable. His moods could shift quickly, and when they did, they affected everything around him. There were moments of incredible affection, followed by moments of distance, jealousy, and tension. Ava found herself constantly navigating those shifts, never fully sure which version of him she would face. At times, his emotional highs were overwhelming in their intensity. Grand gestures, late-night calls, promises that felt larger than life. But just as quickly, those highs could collapse into silence or frustration. That unpredictability created a kind of emotional instability that made it difficult for Ava to feel grounded. She wasn't just in a relationship. She was inside a cycle that kept changing without warning. Sinatra's jealousy was another side that Ava didn't hide. He was deeply possessive, especially when it came to Ava's career and the attention she received. Being one of the most desired women in Hollywood meant constant public interest, and Sinatra didn't handle that easily. Ava later reflected on how that jealousy created pressure in their relationship, turning admiration into conflict. What started as passion often became control, and that line blurred more over time. There were moments where even casual interactions with co-stars or public appearances would trigger tension. Sinatra didn't just want her love. He wanted exclusivity, attention, reassurance. And for Ava, who valued her independence, that became suffocating. She wasn't someone who could be confined, and the more pressure she felt, the more the relationship began to strain. But perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of their relationship was Sinatra's dependence on her. Ava once implied that Sinatra leaned on her emotionally in a way that became overwhelming. He didn't just love her, he needed her. And while that might sound romantic on the surface, in reality, it created imbalance. Ava wasn't just a partner. She became a source of stability for him, and carrying that weight took a toll. There were times when his sense of self-worth seemed tied to her presence, and that kind of dependence made it difficult for either of them to breathe within the relationship. Ava found herself in a position where she wasn't just sharing her life, she was holding his together. And over time, that responsibility became exhausting. There were also the public scandals, moments that turned their private struggles into headlines. Their relationship didn't exist quietly. It was constantly under scrutiny. Arguments, separations, reconciliations, everything played out in front of the world. Ava later suggested that this pressure only intensified their problems. Instead of working through issues privately, they were forced to live them publicly, turning real emotions into public spectacle. Every disagreement had the potential to become a headline. Every absence, every rumor, every glance was analyzed. That kind of exposure made it nearly impossible to protect anything personal. And for two people already dealing with intense emotions, that added pressure made everything heavier. Sinatra's career struggles during parts of their relationship added another layer of tension. There were periods when his career wasn't at its peak, and Ava was still thriving. That imbalance created frustration. Ava never saw herself as competing with him, but the situation created a dynamic where success and insecurity collided. Sinatra's need to reclaim his position in Hollywood sometimes came with emotional consequences that affected their relationship deeply. He was fighting not just for roles, but for relevance, for identity. And during those moments, the pressure he felt internally often spilled into their relationship. Ava, on the other hand, continued to work, to succeed, to move forward. That contrast created a silent divide, one that neither of them fully addressed, but both of them felt. Ava also hinted at something more subtle, but just as important. Sinatra, for all his talent and charm, had a side that could be self-destructive. He lived intensely, and that intensity didn't always lead to stability. There were patterns, emotional highs followed by difficult lows. Ava found herself caught in that cycle, trying to understand it while also protecting herself from it. There were moments when Sinatra seemed to push things too far, as if testing the limits of the relationship itself. Whether it was through arguments, distance, or emotional withdrawal, it created a pattern that became harder to ignore. Ava wasn't afraid of intensity, but she understood that without balance, intensity could become destructive. Despite all of this, Ava never denied that she loved him. In fact, that's what made the story so powerful. The truth she revealed wasn't about hatred. It was about complexity. She saw both sides of Sinatra, the man who could be deeply loving and the man who could be incredibly difficult. There were moments of genuine connection, moments where everything felt right, where the chaos disappeared, and what remained was something real. But those moments didn't last long enough to sustain the relationship. They were powerful, but they were temporary. Their relationship eventually came to an end, but it didn't end cleanly. It left behind emotions that never fully disappeared. Ava would later describe Sinatra as one of the great loves of her life, but also one of the most challenging. That contradiction defined everything about them: love and conflict, passion and exhaustion, connection and distance, all existing at the same time. And that's the truth that stands out the most. Not a simple story of love, not a clean narrative of romance, but a real, complicated relationship between two people who felt everything intensely and paid the price for it. Ava Gardner didn't reveal a version of Frank Sinatra that was entirely different from what the world saw. She revealed the part that was harder to understand, the part behind the spotlight, the part that made their love unforgettable, but also unsustainable.